everybody. I'm Mr. Dude 1001, and this is the history of aviation in 13 minutes and 30 seconds. Alright, so before we start, there are 4 unfulfilled promises of flight: jetpacks, flying cars, supersonic commercial flight, and commercial space flight. Now, let's get into the history. 2000 BC. So this guy named Emperor Shun, his dad tried to kill him by pushing him off a tower, so he used 2 big bamboo hats as parachutes to land safely on the ground. And then in 1500 BC, this guy named Wan Hu made a chair with 47 rockets attached to it. Long story short, he exploded. And then came along the legend of Icarus and Daedalus. Icarus flew too close to the sun and his wings melted. This inspired people to actually start looking into what it would take to get a human off the ground. Anyway, the first person to fly used kites in 800 BC. So a Chinese guy got strapped to a kite to see how long a tunnel needed to be, and they used the Pythagorean theorem using the kite to determine the length of a tunnel needed to start an invasion. Alright, now in the year 1010, there were these guys called tower jumpers. Most of them died, and people learned relatively nothing from them. But this famous guy, Elburn of Malmesbury, and his nickname was the Flying Monk. He jumped in 1010 and survived with 2 broken legs and never walked again. All he got from his experiment was if he had had more tail feathers, he would have flown. So fast forward quite a bit. Now you have this guy named Franz Richel in 1912. He jumped off of the tower with a blanket, basically, and then he died. And then rewind a little bit now to Leonardo da Vinci, who is an Italian artist and scientist. He lived from 1452 to 1519, and he was called the prophet of flight. He conducted the first recorded study of aeronautics. He sketched flying machines and propellers, but never published anything in his lifetime. He also wrote backwards journals so that only he could read them. Okay, and then Da Vinci and birds. People thought that planes could be the same as birds, and Da Vinci believed this also. And they thought that using a concept of an ornithopter, which is an aircraft that flies using flapping wings, that they could probably get off the ground. Da Vinci died, and then had a friend guard his notebooks, and then when he died, the notebooks all got released. Codex Atlanticus was the best of Leonardo da Vinci, basically, and that was a summation of all of his journals whenever they finally got released to the public. But by the time they were released, we were way farther along than what was in the notebooks. And then Giovanni Borelli proved biologically that people can't fly using arms, which was kind of obvious now, but it was a big thing back then. And then came parachutes, which controlled falling, and the Chinese made it. The first recorded parachute was by Louis Sebastian Lenormand, who lived from 1757 to 1837. He made a 14-foot parachute and then jumped off a building, which he survived. Then people had the idea for hot air balloons, specifically the Montgolfier brothers. They saw sheets floating around in the wind, theorized about hot air balloons. On June 4th of 1783, the first hot air balloon flew. On that hot air balloon, there was a sheep, a rooster, and a duck. Next, it was time to put people onto the hot air balloon. The king's historian and the king's other friend were the first people to go aloft in a balloon because the king wanted to have some part in this history, but also didn't really want to die if the thing failed. And they were the first people to go aloft in a hot air balloon. And they were the second people to ever fly behind the Chinese kite guy. Okay, so up until that point, people thought balloons were the only way to fly, but then the British still wanted fixed wing flight. So, George Cayley discovered the airfoil. The airfoil had a few main parts, specifically the leading edge, the chord length, the thickness, the upper camber, the lower camber, and the trailing edge. There was also a principle of angle of attack and relative wind. These all contributed to the 4 forces of flight: lift, weight, drag, and thrust. Now, George Cayley has that airfoil under his belt, and he is now considered the father of aviation. As a side note, George Cayley lived from 1773 to 1857. So he had the idea of an inclined surface on the air, and he used a barn door at first with no camber. But for his 1804 glider, it was heavier than air. It had a fixed wing that generated lift, and it also had horizontal and vertical tail stabilizers. It was not powered or maneuverable yet. And then Cayley started experimenting with cambers, and his whirling arm experiments discovered lift versus angle of attack. Lift is generated by low air pressure above the wing and high air pressure below the wing. Anyway, he figured out that cambered wings generate lift better than a flat surface, and he actually shared his work, unlike Leonardo da Vinci. His research was the most important papers in the invention of an airplane. And then in 1849 was the full-size glider. The first person to fly this full-size glider was the 10-year-old son of a surgeon. This was still Cayley. And then in 1853, there was a single-wing glider that flew George Cayley's coachman. At the time, they called gliders governable parachutes, though. Next came Alphonse Fenard, which was the father of flying models. He made toy planes using rubber bands to spin the propeller. His plane of four flew 181 feet in 11 seconds. The plane of four was his toy plane. This was the one that inspired the Wright brothers. Anyway, Otto Lilienthal was a very influential guy also. He made 2,000 glider flights. His 1891 glider was kind of weird and it only glided 80 feet. He had this hill that he was famous for. He made a hill and kept all his glider stuff in a shed on top. And then for his 1894 glider, his new glider flapped. And then he made a book called Bird Flight as a Basis of Aviation. And then he moved to a second hill where he had more space, and now he could glide 1,150 feet. In 1896, Lilienthal fell off his glider and died of fall damage. His last words were, "Sacrifices must be made." Okay, but Lilienthal's achievements were 2,000 glider flights again, and 18 functioning gliders. And he actually was in the air for more time than anyone else at the time. Alright, next comes along Octave Chanute, who published all aeronautical history in his book in 1894, and it was called The Progress of Flying Machines. He made the best glider yet and also flew 2,000 times. By this time, Chanute was getting pretty old, and Augustus Herring becomes his assistant. And his first glider copied Lilienthal, and then he decided that it didn't have enough wings, so he put 10 of them on a glider and called it a katydid. And then he decided that 10 wings was too many, and he made a triplane, and then decided that 3 wings was still too many, so he took 1 off. But out of all of his gliders, the 1896 Chanute Herring glider worked best. Then he started mentoring other flyers, such as the Wright brothers. Next is Samuel Langley, who lived from 1834 to 1906. He made steam power model planes and flew them around DC. He also used his connections to the Smithsonian to get going monetarily. He had 4 phases in his testing. He did the whirling arm like George Cayley, and then he did rubber band powered models like Pinod, and then he eventually did a steam powered model and then made a steam powered plane. In 1887 he had a 10 horsepower engine for the plane attached to the whirling arm, and he also used flat plates with no camber. In 1891, Langley goes to an exhibit, and Stringfellow's model is there, who I'll be talking about soon. He starts making modifications to Stringfellow's model, and he makes 7 steam-powered planes, numbered 0 through 6. 0 was too heavy, 1 was too light, 2 was too flimsy, 3 had a bad motor. Okay, Stringfellow. John Stringfellow, who lived from 1799 to 1833, also wanted to do a steam engine. So he made a model, and ironically, he put his model on a string line so that he would be able to control it a little bit. He made a model that works and then kicked the bucket. Okay, anyway, back to Langley. He made a catapult for aerodromes. Well, that's what airplanes were called at the time, on top of a houseboat. That was not a good idea. His number 4 aerodrome was the first one on the boat, but it didn't have a catapult yet because he wanted to try to drop the plane first. In 1896, his number 5 plane glides, and Alexander Graham Bell was also there because they were friends. His 1896 plane took 2 turns and then ran out of steam. It was the first successful sustained powered flight. Anyway, aerodrome number 6, it's now November of 1896. It flew for 1 minute and 45 seconds. And then finally came along the Wright brothers. There were 4 brothers and 1 sister, but Wilbur and Orville are the only cool ones. They had a bike shop, and in the winter, because no one likes riding bikes in the winter, I guess, for some reason. Anyway, in the winter, they worked on their airplane hobby. No one had figured out how to control planes yet. And then Wilbur finally figured it out because he was messing around with a box. So in 1899, Wilbur took a kite down to Dayton, and he used control lines to steer the kite, and he figured out, oh crap, the box thingy works. So now cables control their airplane. They also added an elevator to their plane so that they could go up and down. Then they went to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to go to a hill just like Lilienthal, called Kill Devil Hills. So in 1899, they had a kite, or their 1900 model had not very good lift, and then their 1901 model was a complete failure with only 1/3 of the lift that it needed. Now in 1901, the Wright brothers were pretty discouraged. They were about to give up, but then Chanute came along and he was like, hey, do you need a mentor? And they all suspected errors in Lilienthal's data for lift. So they cast Lilienthal aside for a minute, and then they made their own data with a wind tunnel. In their testing, they figured out that every different shape of a wing had different data. And they tested Lilienthal's wing shape and figured out that he was right, they just weren't applying it correctly. In their 1901 glider fight, the plane yaw goes crazy and it crashes in a flat spin. So they decided to make a rudder for their 1902 glider. Their 1902 glider worked perfectly, but it wasn't powered. So in 1902, they applied for a patent, which they got in 1906. The Wright brothers wanted to generate lift, figure out control, like pitch, roll, and yaw, have a lightweight engine and propeller, and find a dumb person to be able to fly it, because there were no like flight instructors or anything back then, so they were just going off nothing. Anyway, for the lightweight engine, they need a mechanician, which is what they called mechanical engineers at the time. So now it's a race, Wrights versus Langley. The Wrights hired Charles Taylor, who built the wind tunnel, and they also built a 12 horsepower engine in 6 weeks. Now this was a lightweight engine, so it could be strapped to the Wright's plane. And Langley hired Charles Manley, who also made an engine for him. Anyway, so now the Wrights had to figure out how they were going to get off the ground. So they started with a boat propeller and trial and error to make it a good air propeller for their plane. Now this propeller had 70% efficiency, and they considered it their greatest accomplishment. Even though they made a fully functioning plane for the first time in history, the propeller seemed to be their greatest accomplishment. So Langley got the government to sponsor him around $50,000, which in today's money adjusted for inflation is about $1 million. So he decided to make the Great Aerodrome, which had poor flight controls because he decided to cut corners, so his plane could only go straight. Now, come December 1903, which is the month of the flying machine, Wrights and Langley are both getting ready to fly. On October 7th, 1903, was Langley's first flight, and the guy who made his engine, also known as Charles Manley, is flying. He catapulted his plane because his houseboat had a catapult on top, and the launch force destroyed the airplane. December 8th, 1903, Langley is back at it, and the plane gets broken because Manley crashed it. But a lot of people were there, and Langley quits out of embarrassment. And then he had a stroke in 1905, and then another one in 1906, and he died. Anyhow, Wilbur, on December 14th, 1903, flew and then crashed in 40 feet because of a stall. On December 17th, 1903, it was Orville's turn. Orville only went 12 seconds and went 100 feet horizontally, but they kept trying, and the last flight of theirs went 852 feet in 59 seconds. This was their fourth flight. If Langley hadn't made his stupid houseboat idea, he might have flown first. But the Wrights were way better prepared, and Langley was very rushed. Now came the time for the Wrights' 1905 Flyer, and it flew for 35 minutes until the fuel ran out, and it could do figure eights. And that is the whole history of flight leading up to the Wright brothers.